Today's feature presentation then is Carol Pearson, Understanding the Power of Stories in Our Lives. Join our nationally recognized author, educator, and former neighbor, Carol Pearson, to learn about how the power of myths and ancient stories apply to our lives today and how they inspire and influence us. Discover how your story, once recognized, can help you better understand your life and chart a path through difficult decisions. So a little bit about Carol, if we may. She is a neighbor. I've known her back 30, 40 years perhaps in University Park. She has received her bachelor's and master's and her Ph.D. from Rice University in the English department that analyzed literature from a psychological perspective, particularly interested in Carl Jung's work around archetypes, or stories, as Carol's latest work, What Stories Are You Living?, refers to these universal underlying patterns. She has been a professor of English at the University of Colorado, the first director of Women's Studies program at the University of Maryland, and vice president and dean of Goucher College. She returned to Maryland as executive director of the James McGregor Burns Academy of Leadership and International Leadership Association, and then to Pacifica Graduate Institute in Santa Barbara, California, as the executive vice president and provost, and then president. During this time, she also expanded her original concept of archetypes to 12, wrote many books, including The Hero Within, Awakening the Heroes Within, Magic at Work, and Persephone Rising, as well as authoring numerous articles. She co-created the Pearson Archetype indicator to help people better understand their motivations, unconscious assumptions, and the narratives they think, tell, and live. We're very pleased to have Dr. Pearson with us today to discuss this interesting and exciting topic, and you will learn a lot. Thank you, Carol.
Thank you, Bonnie. It's really special for me to be doing this. I spent a whole lot of my life in University Park and College Heights Estates, and the University of Maryland. Actually, the University of Maryland was my favorite place I ever taught. So much so that I taught 2 separate times there. So this feels like old home week for me, even though some of the cast of characters are the same and many are different, as happens over time. Anyway, I'm glad to be here, and we can, Loretta and or Carter, we could start with the slides. I have a few slides, and just to get some visuals and to keep me organized. And starting with this slide is about, you've heard about my books. Well, The Hero Within, which started my thinking about this subject of the importance of story in human life, and other than what I learned in graduate school, but in terms of really applying it to applying story analysis to individual lives, happened when I was on Underwood Street and a women's studies director at the University of Maryland, and I was supposed to be writing something on feminist scholarship, and basically the ideas from this book just captured me. I felt like part of my brain was demanding that I write it, so I did, and it led to. I'm still a feminist, but it led to a different major focus in my life, which over time also led me into leadership positions. And the most recent, I'm talking about the most recent book that I've written that feels like a culmination of all of my work on story in real human life. And it's just out. Literally, it came out it came out a week ago last Tuesday. So it's very, very new. And for me, very exciting. And the publisher is the publisher of the PMAI, the instrument that Bonnie mentioned. And they had a really brilliant visual artist that works for them. And he came up with the idea of the phoenix on the cover. And I thought, how perfect for this pandemic. That, first of all, if you know the phoenix every 1,000 years or so burns itself up and then is another phoenix, just as still the phoenix, only better. Still the phoenix, only all cleaned up. And so I have a sense, to me, this pandemic feels like 1,000 years. But my hope with it is that it's giving all of us time to sort of stop and think. Some of us in lockdown, like I have been, and others working really hard. But nevertheless, time to stop and regroup about what stories do we want to be living individually and collectively, and what do we really care about? What do we really believe in? So that's what I'm here to talk about. Although with a focus particularly on our own lives. Next slide. Bonnie already mentioned this in talking about my life, but the book is actually written to support the Pearson archetype indicator. Now, archetypes are just universal stories and characters. It sounds obscure. It's actually pretty simple, actually, that they're recurring stories and that people tell over time. And we can see that in even there's a whole genre of romance fiction that's about the lover archetype being expressed. There's hero stories that are mainly war stories. We know that there's a kind of patterns in literature of kinds of stories, and that we can then see kinds of stories in people. So if you get curious about that and you want to take the PMAI, you can just go online and do it. And you can find out what stories you typically think, tell, and live. Next slide. Storytelling is so natural to human beings. It is, it is distinctive of human beings. There's really animals and plants. They don't tell stories. What humans do, we're storytelling creatures. As Jim Lauer said, as human beings, we continually tell ourselves stories. Too few of us even recognize that we're telling stories or what they are, or that we can change them, or in turn transform our very destinies. This is, to me, a very exciting understanding to have. And now there's many sociologists who are also anthropologists who believe that part of how human beings have been able to evolve so quickly, or relatively quickly in comparison, say, to other species, is that we learn to talk. So when we had a new idea, we could share it, and then somebody else would get it. Now, before that, people could do something new, and people could watch them and learn from it. But this is a very different kind of phenomenon. And if you think about how much people tell stories, you could just think about, back when we used to work together in person, for many of us, we're chatting. How are you doing? Oh, the commute was just horrible. I got into this line of traffic, and this person did this and that and did that, and I almost had a wreck. or telling a story to a child, not the fictional stories we tell, but explaining why something happens. Very often we start with, here's how I learned this, and this is what I did. Or an example of somebody else that's in story form. So the subject that sounds a little bit esoteric is in fact what we do every day naturally as human beings. Next slide. Stephen Denning, who was a colleague of mine for a bit, is an expert on leadership and leadership storytelling. And he really started opening doors to understanding the impact of neuroscience on how we understand story. But he started out at the World Bank. He was in charge of a program, and he was trying to convince people at the World Bank that the world had changed with modern technology and the internet. Now, this was back a few years, before everybody kind of got it. But he said he would give all these presentations, one after the other, about with data and information. And he said they would say that very nice presentation and nothing would change. And then he found out, then he had an experience that allowed him to tell them a story. And the story he told was a very simple story. He said, not too long ago, I got a request. And that request was from a small country, and the person in charge of building roads, they wanted to know the best substance to use to make roads. And the World Bank, we formed a commission to study that, and we had researchers, and we looked into it for quite a long time, and then that was given to writers who wrote it up in very compelling and clear way. And then there were editors, and then it went to several layers of bureaucracy to be approved, and then it was published. And by that time, the man that had called me had already finished changing all the roads that he was supposed to, or paving all the roads that he was supposed to, because he called two of his, people who did very similar work that he did in other countries. They told him what they did, and he'd already done it. And Steve moved from that experience to becoming an expert in telling leaders that if you want change, you need to tell stories. And some of this from neuroscience, as you can see with this diagram here, happens because when we just give data, what happens is that very small parts of the brain light up. But when you tell a story, it could be like a Christmas tree, because so many, it's tapping into so many different kinds of human qualities. And part of the theory is the reason that storytelling is so impactful and that stories are so important is how much attention the brain gives to them. Next slide. Byron Katie has gotten actually quite famous from talking about how stories can trap us. And what she mainly talks about is the negative stories we tell ourselves, like, I'm no good, like, oh, that just proves it, I'll never amount to anything. I'm always messing up. Those kinds of stories that we can tell ourselves that are self-defeating. And she tends to say, don't tell stories, but what she means is don't tell stories that aren't true. And that it's a very important thing to start becoming conscious of what stories we're actually thinking, because the way that the mind works, the brain actually gives us a story. When things happen, the tendency is of the mind actually, is to organize events into a structure that gives them meaning. And the most natural ways for human beings to do, it's not the only way, but the most natural way for human beings to do that is through narrative structures. And so that in truth, the only way to get rid of a negative story is to tell a better one. Because the brain and the mind are story creating entities. And so that the more that we can actually notice our thoughts, the more freedom we have in our lives. Because the other piece of that is if the brain gives you a story, it does it really fast. And that means that most of the time, what we initially think is what we believe then to be true. And the more that we can recognize and have a way to identify, okay, what story is this? And would other people agree with this? What would somebody else maybe say about this? What does make me? How do I feel when I think this? And you can see even with our country right now, with the conspiracy theories of all kinds. We also have collective stories that are undermining our sense of what is true and right. Next slide. Now, archetypal stories, my work is with archetypal stories, and that term, archetypes, comes from C.G. Jung, as many of you know. And all an archetype is, as I said, a universal character or story. There are also archetypes that are natural or that are process-oriented that you can see in science, meaning patterns, recurring patterns. But the particular ones Jung talked about and that I talk about are qualities of human beings and the ways that certain kind of qualities qualities are created into a structure is through the patterns. As you see here, archetypes are the unconscious images of the instincts themselves. In other words, they're the patterns of instinctual behavior in people. So the 12 archetypes that I now work with are all related to qualities of being human, ways of being human. And as we live their stories, we gain their gifts. For example, the warrior archetype is really around protecting the people, protecting yourself, creating safety through dealing with danger. And living that story fosters courage. Now, all the archetypes have a kind of courage, but this is a kind of courage of standing up for what you believe in and setting boundaries and even fighting and dying, or verbally fighting. Or then you can think about if you live that story, you develop this courage. Well, the lover archetype is quite different. Nevertheless, the lover archetype, if you live a love story, whether it's falling in love with your sweetie or loving your kids and loving your friends or loving life, but more in the relationships, in the sense of human relationships, it's about being able to have the courage to be seen, to be close, to really see another human being, to be and to make a commitment to that person. And so that's also a kind of courage. And nevertheless, the point I'm making is living the stories develops the human gifts. And the more conscious we are as we live those stories, the more able we are then to um, to critique how we're living them, essentially, and to live more moral and useful lives. Next slide. All right, having said that, there's several ways we can use this material. After this part, I'm gonna actually talk a little bit about all 12 archetypes, and then we'll have some time to talk with one another. But now I'd like you to, just as background, to think you can use this about understanding what's going on in the world today. You know, who's living what story? You can use this to understand different people in your life, what story are they living? But I was particularly thinking that it might be useful in our setting and in this rather short time together to think about the stories in you, because you can't really do the other two unless you see them in yourself. So what I'd like you to do is take a moment or so quietly to reflect on what your life has been like during the pandemic. And we might have extremely different experiences, or what you imagine life might be like post-pandemic. And just pay attention to what those stories are, not trying to name them, but just what story you're telling yourself about this. And if you feel really brave, you can put them in the chat box. What do you think? Or if it's, unless it is something private that you do not want to share. And so let's take about 2 minutes or 2 or 3 minutes to just settle in for you and your life. And then I'll give you some information about the 12 archetypes. You may find that one or more of them is related to your stories. So let's start now. Okay, feel free to write in the chat box. Continue to write in the chat box. In a minute, I'm going to start talking about the 12 archetypes. But first, let me say that these particular 12 archetypes are all positive. You can't possibly find out anything bad about yourself by reflecting on if you have any of these with you and as parts of you. There are also ones that have assisted with human evolution over time, so that they have positive and more primitive possibilities in how they're expressed, and that I'm not going to talk about the primitive ones today. Some of them are not so pretty, but as I was saying about the importance of recognizing you're living a story, is that in the way that I'm going to be sharing with you, they're all at least normally, fine ways of being, and emerge into the possibility of being even more important. And then that next slide, and even more evolved. In my view, this is the pandemic and a lot of other things going on are a call for humans to evolve. And that means evolving all of these archetypes as we live their stories. So here are the 12 with some words, and I'll just start a little bit, and you may recognize or not your story among them, which could be a combination or it could be a slightly different version, but nevertheless, it's a way for you to start having a way to name your thoughts if you haven't, your narrative thoughts, if you haven't done that before. The Idealist archetype starts with kind of the innocent child, the spontaneous innocent child, grows up into very often living a story of some degree of faith and trust and optimism, often then buoyed by one's ideals or one's faiths or one's beliefs. And so stories tend to be positive. Stories tends to be affirming of life. I noticed for me that a lot of my ideas about what I'm going to do at the end of this pandemic have a touch of the idealist, in the sense that they're always really good. And the story I tell, even the story I told about, well, we've had time. There's an idealist quality to the story I told about the pandemic, that we have time to stop and regroup and see and decide what we care about and live that. That was actually, there's a lot of idealism in that. Well, so, many other archetypes might see it a different way. Every archetype has a potential downside, and the downside of the idealist is too much optimism, missing the downside of life, maybe getting conned or overly trusting. Every one of the archetypes the downside would be sometimes too much of it. So the realist is balanced for the idealist. The realist very often has had some pretty tough experiences, maybe even felt like a motherless child at various times, as any of us can. And that grows up into having a very realistic attitude about life. That is, it's not too much. It is, don't expect too much. Deal well with what is. And that often leads to stories that are focusing on being practical and on practical and solving the problems when they come up, noticing danger ahead of time, trying to head it off. And then within the realm of the realist life, deal with what you could deal with where you are. The house is a mess, start with the dishes. That's the realist way, is what can I do and how can I get good enough at things to hold everything together. The realist can also lead to the caregiver, because the realist has that realism leads to a sense of empathy for other people, recognizing one's own vulnerability and theirs, and thus becoming empathic. And the caregiver archetype is all about stories that, you know what it is, where a person is generous, is nurturing. The story is, I see there's a need. I see the need, and I am going to help, and here's what I'm going to do. Or I see the need, I can't help, I'm going to go find somebody who can. It is very other focused, but the others, but it doesn't work very well unless the caregiver also takes care of his or herself. And with that, with that recognition, I must take care of myself. There's always more people and things that need to be taken care of than any one person can do. So at some point, the caregiver, if so as not to be totally depleted, needs to set boundaries, and that's where the warrior comes in. The warrior archetype is, as I've already said, it's what's classically seen as the hero. Forceful, competitive, I want to win, I want to achieve my goals, but I also, in that process, am protecting myself and protecting other people. And so a story would be, I see this danger and I'm going to be strong enough to meet it. Even if I die, I will resist that force. And our other warrior stories are really about winning, that I set this goal and I'm going to achieve it, and I'm going to achieve it in competition very often with others or against enemies. The next archetype actually starts a sequence that often has to do with identity. The seeker archetype is somebody generally independent and adventurous with a story of, I am unhappy here. There's got to be something better. Or I am bored and there is something more interesting and I will find it. It's all about stories, all about taking a journey, going on a pilgrimage, going on a quest, being a pioneer. All of those kinds of stories are seeker stories. And it's also related to identity formation. And it is typically, as we seek new experiences, we're seeking what resonates for us. And in that way, when we see that, we're building a sense of who we are. The balance, the seeker is very often never satisfied, actually, and always seeking for more. And, for the young right now, it's the next new thing very often, and maybe some of us too. The lover, you can think about the love story, the classic love story, but I already have said, but also close friendship. But it can also can emerge into spiritual love, agape, not just eros. And all of that is there with lover archetype. So the lover archetype stories are much more about connecting with other people. I step out and I want to find Mr. or Ms. Right, or somebody I could really talk to. Or with children, it's not the caregiver part of it. It's just I just love being with this child, and I want to be close, and I want to develop the child. Or in spirituality, it's often mystic, of a sense of oneness. And you might see that in some of your stories in terms of what is happening now, what is happening in your future. The lover finds out who he or she loves, finds identity by commitment. I do this work that I love. I marry this person. I do that, I do this, I do that. All these things I commit to. I commit because I love them, and then I know who I am. Whereas the seeker can end up quite lonely, the lover can end up quite enmeshed. And so those two kind of balance each other. And when I say balance, I mean if somebody's living both of those stories. The revolutionary, we're living in kind of revolutionary times. Yeah, I was thinking about our country and realizing that what we have in common with all the supposed culture wars, everybody's feeling a little bit unhappy and dissatisfied with, and wanting to change, to see things that are wrong and wanting to change them. The difference is on what's wrong and how you should change them. But there is that sense, and it's very strong in the world today. And the revolutionary as in this system is not just about changing your workplace or changing the government, or it's also can be internalized in terms of deciding to revolutionize your life and change a lot about who you are. Or it can be a time where some things life has taken things away from us. It's really a destroyer archetype coming and taking things that we valued away, and we must reinvent ourselves. And that's part of the revolutionary too, of saying, okay, I can let go of what I was before, and move ahead. And the moving ahead almost always evokes the creator archetype. And the creator is, what we would imagine as creative people, some of whom are artists or musicians or radical innovators, creating, or people doing crafts, creating their homes and making them very unique, and expressing who they are. Yeah, very typically when we have the revolutionary, we might be tearing apart things, and the creator, it's kind of like somebody doing weaving or knitting, weaving it back together into a new way or a new form. So in those four, the seeker finds who I am by the experiences I have, the new experiences, the lover by committing, the revolutionary by getting rid of what doesn't fit, and the creator by recreating our lives and looking at our lives about seeing who we are by what we have created. And then the last four are the characters in the medieval court, the king or the ruler, the king or queen, that needs the jester to keep things lively and also poke fun at the ruler, the court magician, and the advisors, the sages. If you have ruler stories, they're very likely about how can I take charge? How can I take charge of this? Could be just this room, could be this organization, it could be this project, and make everything work. And usually involves being responsible for outcomes, and either self-responsibility or responsibility for other people, and figuring out how to make them be able to come together with some kind of work together. The corridor could be such an organization. Some people are taking responsibility in that. That might be a ruler story. And ideally in a sense of stewardship as ruler. The gesture is necessary for some rulers, however, not the stewardship kind, but some rulers tend to get kind of arrogant, and gestures are necessary to poke fun at them. But the gesture in any of us is also the part of us that would really just like to enjoy life. You know, for the ruler, the meaning of life is to get everything working. For the gesture, it is to be free and spontaneous and playful and have a wonderful time. You can see how those two would, a little bit of both of those would be good, so that the ruler doesn't get controlling and the gesture doesn't party all night and forget to go to work. So, and then finally, the last two. The Magician archetype is about healing and transformation. Very often focuses on connectivity sometimes with the natural world, but often with other people. May use various kinds of influence. And the stories are not stories of telling people what to do or lightening up with play, but connecting them in a way that they can work together for collective transformation. Or it can be a relationship between you as a magician and a person you're trying to help, where you develop a bond that you're very connected and you can see what is true for them and what is possible for them, and help them perhaps see that in themselves as well. And then finally, but very often the sage can also be in the realm of the invisible and what can't be measured necessarily, or studied in a lab. And so it includes religious ideas and various kinds of awareness that isn't tangible and measurable. And the sage is the balance for that, which is it could be the researcher, the scholar, also a detective or an investigative journalist. It's a story about, I'm curious about this. I am curious about this and I'm thinking about it. Many of us who are, it was, since I've spent my life in the academic world, it's natural that when I thought about the pandemic, I thought, oh, I could write a book and I could think about things. And, I'm being locked down, cool. Not that I underestimated the damage what was happening in the world, but that archetype, it was natural for me, and therefore something that I could do that felt appropriate as I made my way through it. However, now that it's been over a year, other archetypes are beginning to speak. So now that's a lot of archetypes, but you get the idea. And the most important thing for our being together is that you just simply get the idea. You could use any words, because once I know there are various archetypes in my thinking, then I can know what their gifts are and what they might help me to be and become. And the same can be true of you. So having said that, we have some time that we could talk, and that could include questions that you have for me on this or how to use it. It could also include sharing about what you saw about yourself. And it's not important that you get all the names right, but sharing would be equally positive at this time, because one of the best ways to learn about this subject is to hear from each other in terms of what you're seeing, in terms of your patterns of thinking.
Carol, this is Lisa Walker. I'm we agreed at the beginning that I might present some questions to you that bubbled up in the chat. And so I think it was Roberta who landed on a question that I was going to ask, which is it true that we live our lives with all of these narratives, all of these stories, in fact, but we may emphasize them at different times. We may forget about, you know, the problems or the issues or the lack of balance from some of them. But is it true that in general, we have all of these within ourselves?
Yes, it is true. These are archetypes that are natural to human beings. And what I could, you know, you already know that I started with literature and then went to people. But part of the reason for that was that what Jung said about the way he could prove that a story was a universal story is that you can see it in the things people create. And of course, in language, stories, literature or movies, those kinds of things would be a thing to look at, although you could also look at architecture and art and music. And so, yes, all these are human, and all these are archetypes that are and positive human qualities, and that have been alive in people since the earliest time. And they all have positive expressions in the world that we live in today. What I found is that some of them, there may be one or more that is really associated with your identity over time. That's usually easier to see when you get to be my age, you know, after a lot of years of living, which you can see, oh yeah, I've always been living this story more than the others, you know, not none of the others. And, but they also, there may be some that are very related to our personality, our choices of what we do for a living, all those kinds of things. You know, it's not an accident that I would identify with the sage archetype and then spend my life in the academic world. Duh, you know, I could sort of get a clue. And what we've found working with people for quite a long time is that archetypes do change at different points in life, not in a set way, although there's some logical ways that often happen. But and you can find that one story has been dominant earlier in one's life, and then it's another one now. Right. And they're natural things, like when you're a kid, you know, there's certain, you know, things that you're like. You might typically, if life is really easy, be a lot more innocent. The innocent part of the idealist could be any age.
So there look to be a number of people, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Let me just say that there look to be a number of people that are familiar maybe with Jung's archetypes. So I've got a couple of questions here. One is, where is the conciliator? It seems like the magician from a different perspective, says Maureen. And Carson says, do you still have an archetype of the orphan?
The conciliator, oh, cool, yeah. Yeah, that's true about the magician. Although sometimes it can be a caregiver too, or a lover. Can have conciliation as a form. So you should also then know that people have put together archetypal systems differently, and archetypes don't have names. Mm-hmm. Really, so that where the boundaries are of one archetype or what it's called will be different. But the answer is yes. And the orphan in the original system that I worked with, there was the orphan archetype was what is realist now.
Ah,
And we changed, and that's changed for this book and for the PMAI, because most of the people who were using this were adult people who are living very functional lives, and many of them professionals, and they didn't identify, they didn't want to be identified as orphan, because that's the more childlike version of the realist archetype. It's the part of us that feels vulnerable and knows that bad things happen. And the realist is the person who's learned to cope with that. But yes, that's where it is. There were three archetypal names that we actually changed because people didn't want to be didn't want to be seen that way. And the other one was originally the revolutionary was the destroyer. And so that was actually more powerful in the sense of understanding that part of life is to let go. And, not really go out and shoot people or anything like that, but to be letting go of things. And in some ways, the term destroyer was kind of a dramatic way of getting the idea that we can't always keep just adding things. If we get overwhelmed.
So I've got some more here if you want. I don't want to interrupt if there was something.
No, let's go ahead. Mm-hmm.
But we've got plenty of time. Peggy says, how do we, once we recognize we are telling a negative story within an archetype, how do we change that narrative? Do we change it by force of, I don't know. Well, how do we change that narrative?
Yeah, that's a more advanced thing, but okay. Well, with a positive one, I can tell you a story, just a quick story. I teach this stuff and I sometimes need to learn it, but I had a house guest, a couple were staying in our house, and I'm in the kitchen in the morning, and he, the guy, walks in and looks very gruff at me and walks out. I go into immediately, I must have done something, and I was like, what did I say? What did I do? And in that particular case, I later said, did I do anything to offend you? And he said, huh? You've been wonderful. Okay, now what I could do with that is, one, if we're telling a story, we can check it with somebody. But the other piece is I realized that was my caregiver upbringing. I'm second generation Swedish immigrant. It's a caregiver culture. You're supposed to always know what people need and provide it. And I realized that, okay, what I'm telling, I went to a negative story that it was part of this archetypal framework that is not healthy. What could I do positively? And I could also look for in the caregiver archetype that part of the higher level caregiver archetype is to be, one, checked with things like that, but the other part is to be caring for people, but at the same time caring for oneself. So I was, it took me a while to care for myself because I was so busy beating up on myself for an imaginary flaw. So it very often, the negative story is the negative part of a positive archetype. And if you can then try to move to what it looks like to live that archetype in a more positive way, that's pretty standard. It can work. You can also just move to a whole different story.
Yeah. So yeah. Carson, it says, I think that's really right on in terms of Carson's point of view, which is Thank you. I think I'm a realist now. I was an orphan and embraced it. It helped. I didn't mind, but I was sheltered.
Mhm. Great. Lovely to hear. Other questions or sharing from people?
Yeah, there is oh, I don't know. Let me do this from Roberta, and maybe we should see whether other people want to put their hands up. Roberta says, I'm a seeker of new findings in science, and I love the God of my faith who accompanies me and graces me with the strength to pursue my goals. I do not fear conventions and do not need their approval to move within my perspective on conventions, creatively interpreting them.
That was a nice way of putting a number of archetypes together as almost like a who am I statement.
Mm-hmm. I can't see if other people have hands up. Does anybody see any hands up? I can go back to some of the other statements people made during the sharing things. Loretta, I should just tell everybody, Loretta summarized the slide that had all 12 of them on in the chat. So if people want to copy the chat, there should be 3 little dots at the bottom of your chat list. You can copy it onto your computer. And I think it might be helpful, Carol, if you could tell us where I get it wrong, the PMAI could be found online, so people could find it.
Well, let me tell you several things. One thing is the PMAI you can get online at the publisher created its own website for this instrument. It's called www.storywell, all smushed together.com. And storywell.com. And you can take it, and there's 2 different ways to take it. You get 2 different reports depending on how much you pay. One of them is simpler, and the other one is a lot more detailed. It depends on also how much you want to know. But I will tell you that right now, with What Story Are You Living coming out, and it's available through through the publisher, Storywell. Or it's available. It's also available on Amazon and other places. And if you buy that book, it's actually cheaper to get the book that gives you a free coupon to take the instrument than it is to take the instrument.
Okay.
So anyway, it's a real bargain. Anyway, if you want to do that. The other thing is that I originally wanted to show more pictures to you and with the archetypes, and I was going to take them off my new website, and I found out that they had too many whatever it is that they have for me to actually use. And but I have a website that if you just want to see pictures of archetypes, and it's carolspearson.com. It's pretty simple. And there's whole sections about each archetype that are there.
That's great. That's helpful.
Yeah.
I don't see any other hands. I could go back to some of the other statements that were made. So here's Clarine. This is on the pandemic. I've not mind being at home. I'm senior and retired, but I've spent a lot of time reaching out to others, friends, family, and trying to be a better contributor to activities for our village, Cheverly Village, learning technology. I've also been made more aware and stressed of the racism and horrible government happenings of the past year.
Yeah, boy, that's a kind of statement I'm hearing a lot, and a number of people that have said it's actually nice being home, but at the same time wanting to contribute to the world. And sometimes it's contributing to the world by a caregiver of of wanting, one person that I know, she calls people who are alone and elderly every day. She has a list, and she continues to care for people as she can from where she is. Others create corridor conversations, and organize things to help people in the situation, which is probably a combination of sage and ruler, maybe a little magician. There's the different archetypes can have been expressed in the ways that people find to continue to contribute, even from home. And of course, some people are working flat out, in hospitals and whatever. But you can also sometimes identify the difference in the contribution. And I've found too, and many people that I've worked with have found that we have a desire to help, because it's really overwhelming, all the need there is in the world. And that sometimes recognizing what our archetypal strengths are, the stories that motivate us to develop skills, will help us know how we can best be of help, because it's overwhelming to try to deal with everything.
I have one message I wanted to from the pandemic, from the thing we did on the pandemic, which was because I've already said about Roberta. This is from Rosemary. During the pandemic, I felt I left one shore, and by last fall, I was totally out to sea, unable to see where I'd left or where I was going. After pandemic, I think my spiritual schedule and my worldwide spiritual community will be the source of direction.
Yeah, I can't know exactly what that's. First of all, it was beautiful. But I would also say that you could use that classically, that would be, it's a seeker journey and a lover end. Only the lover is a spiritual lover. But a wonderful story about how to use.
What I failed to say in there was that I went back to full mothering. I left my house with my husband and I and fell into a family and have been fully mothering. And so I didn't know how to get back to where I was.
Oh, okay. That was very literal.
Yeah.
Cool. Mary Cummins raises a question. Can you say more about the neuroscience of stories? I think that one thing, Carol, is when you showed that slide, some of the photos were over the top of some of the slides, so you couldn't see, at least on my computer, you couldn't see all of the brain, so you couldn't see.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, there's tons about neuroscience. One thing is, what you need to read to your kids? Well, it makes them smarter. How does it make them smarter? If people grow up where they only hear certain stories, that's the stories that their brain will continue to use to make sense of everything they hear. And what's, so the family stories will could be narrow. There's not many fictional stories. And then there's a lot coming in from the culture that isn't that good, isn't that healthy in terms of stories that can lead, okay. So that the more stories that people imaginatively experience, like when you identify with a character, you identify with a character, for your brain, it's almost like you're experiencing it. And so it lights up visually, it lights up all your your sensation. It's almost like you're hearing it in your mind, you're seeing it in your mind, you're feeling it in your mind. You may even smell it in your mind. And that a very important thing today. There's a great book called In Over Our Heads by Robert Keegan, and many of you might know, that says most of us don't have the cognitive complexity to deal with life today. And that's one of the things that get people turning negative. And the more stories that people, different kind of stories that people experience, and that can be reading or going to movies, good movies, it can be traveling, it can be knowing diverse people, the more cognitively complex the brain gets. And that means that the way we make meaning of what happens, we have more choices. Mm-hmm. And we could even do a practice. There's one practice called the rule of 6. Don't make a decision without telling 6 very different stories about it, to try to get out of the lock. Another really key thing is about brain science is that mirror neurons also light up parts of our brain when we watch people do things. So, the kid helping, mom or dad with the chores is learning in a way where the brain can even trigger parts of the body that when you're watching, they're being watched. So that also means that if you were wanting to have more of a particular story, that is, be able to live a story you haven't been able to live. Like I'm the least, somebody who says I'm the least caring person in the world, I think I better be a little nicer to people. Well, part of the answer to that is watch people like that. Watch with the attitude of soaking it up, taking it in, letting your body respond, letting go of whatever your resistance was to that. Read books about wonderful, giving people. And, whatever archetype it is, that we actually can awaken human capacities in ourselves imaginatively. We have these really amazing brains. And the other thing we can do is act differently. That because our synapses in our brains tend to connect habitually. Because we do the same things over and over again, and they get all set up to be able to support that. And then if we consciously act in a new way, the synapses actually will reconnect with other parts of the brain.
Oh, that's interesting.
It's just, I think it's just the coolest thing there ever was.
Yeah. So Roberta has had her hand up for a while, so I'm going to call on her. Roberta, if you're still here, I know you've made comments in the chat box, and I think Carol can look at those later, but are you there, and do you want to ask a question?
I'm here.
Okay.
I think you've turned off my video because I had a quotation by John Donahue as well. Oh. I would like to live like a river flows, carried by the surprise of its own unfolding. That's one thing. And I took some of I did a quick look at online for the PMAIs. The Storywell charges for the interpretation. The freebies end up asking questions which I can't answer because some of them I agree with and some of them I don't. They've lumped things together so that it's not an authentic answer to agree or disagree. It's a little of both, and they don't allow that.
Oh, you mean the way the PMAI actually works?
I'm sorry?
You're talking about the PMAI items?
Yes. There are a couple of them that I've also put online. There's an archetypes.com quiz, and there was another one. When I went to the Storywell site, basically they charge for the interpretation. The others would be free and just for you to take to find out.
Yeah, it's fine.
The ambiguity.
Can she come back? What I would say, by the way, is the PMAI is actually a tested, reliable instrument. The freebies are all just made up. That doesn't mean they're not right,
Right.
It just means that it's not proven that they're right. Yeah.
Okay. So the Storywell PMAI is the authentic one?
It's been through a lot of tests. And it meets the, you know, the standards for a good psychometric instrument. But a lot of it is also the how you deal with your responses. The actual items have to do with individual archetypes, but the theory in my book and other materials there, the theory is not saying you're one thing.
No.
And the theory is, and that, you know, even a single story can have elements of more than one archetype.
Right.
And what you get as a result is 3 of your highest scores, 1 that's your lowest, which is what you might neglect, or it may be underdeveloped, and several in the middle that could be interpreted as various ways. But for whoever was saying, yes, we have all the archetypes, that's the key to the fact that we don't have to stereotype ourselves and say, I am this kind of person. Right. Because as life happens and we deal with other people, we're always growing. And the different archetypal stories help with that. Yeah.
There's something about the 4th dimension of time when we're talking about atomic reality. I forget the name of it, but I was listening to something about Einstein's theory of relativity, and it's a ball at time 1, it's a ball at time 2, but something may have happened between the 2 times.
Right.
Change the ball so it's not the same.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you. And I enjoyed your comments.
Clarine Heichel from Cheverly has a question. Clarine.
Actually, it's more of a comment. Thank you very much. This was really very interesting. I just wanted to share. I've been in a memoir writing class with the same 10 or 11 people since last August. And I can see their stories. We can start to see which ones are the seekers and which ones are the spiritualists. We get a prompt. So everybody has kind of a prompt. It could be generosity, or it could be, you know, a joy. And the stories that people come up with, we can kind of start saying, well, that sounds like you. But all the push is to describe what you just said, Dr. Pearson, about describing all the senses. And by the time you get to a simple story of describing what it felt like, what it smelled like, how you felt when you were with certain people, almost every time it has moved people to tears. And it's also, people have said, I think by writing this, it revealed something about me. And I know it has done that several times with me. And it has brought me to tears when the story was not necessarily a sad story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, I mean, it's just what you've just said, was just very interesting to dig deeper into what our experiences were and then how we write them and remember them.
Yeah. Well, and that's, you know, what I'm showing you is how to just get the general idea and have names for things. But memoir is a wonderful way to just write. And inevitably the archetypes will be there, and so will your uniqueness, you know, what is essential about you as you move through all the things that you just said, you know. So it is really a great thing to do, to see it after the fact if you write the memoir first, or if you look at identifying the particular archetypes you've lived, to then put it into your life story. You don't have to name archetypes, but you'd have it in the back of your mind and be able to recognize, hey, that's when I was learning this. And here's when I was learning that. And here's when I wasn't very good at it yet. You know? Wonderful.
Carol, Loretta made a comment, which is, as we talk about resuming activities with and for elders, it's been interesting to see how many are comfortable with remaining at home and joining by computer. I wonder what this says about our archetypes.
I don't know. I think it might have something to do more with type, you know, introversion and extroversion. But I think even extroverts become more introverted as they get older.
Mhm.
And I was just in a meeting today where people of my age who are still professionally active, and they were saying, I am so glad that I can still, one of them said, I'm still a trainer. I can be a trainer and not have to get on an airplane. That I can just have my nice life and have a cup of tea and come teach something or train so I think part of it is that as the older we get, the less energy most of us have. Not everybody, but most of us have less energy, and we may want to spend less of our time getting to places than actually engaging in some kind of way that did not require a lot of time in an automobile, a plane, or whatever.
Right, right. So we've had a lot of thank yous, people that have dropped off the call but said thank you very much for this interesting presentation. This has been really helpful. It's helped me reflect on things. It's really a good session. One in particular I want to read, it's from Maddie Siegel, who says, thank you for a wonderful presentation. It's given me insight into why I do some of what I do. You've even given me ideas for the novel that I'm writing, such as the emotions readers can have with their responses to what's happening to a character, especially the protagonist.
That's so lovely.
Yeah.
Yeah, this stuff is great for writers.
Exactly. And Roberta wants to point out that introverts become more extroverted as they age.
I have. Yeah.
Are there any more questions here? And I don't know, Bonnie, do you or Loretta or Carter have anything you want to raise? We're getting close to the 3:30 bewitching hour, when we said we would stop. So anybody? Bonnie?
I would like to add just that I think it was in the ARC magazine that they talked about retired people through the pandemic doing a lot of reminiscing, which is in fact remembering stories.
Stories, yeah.
So the word reminisce seems to fit really well here. So thank you for this really, really interesting, wonderful presentation. I would like to also then just take this minute to put in an announcement for our next quarter conversation, which is Saturday, April 24th, 2 o'clock to 3:30. Also, the Bard in April, as you may know, April is Shakespeare's birthday. So we are celebrating Shakespeare's birthday in our own way. Hydesvillian Janet Griffin, the newly retired Director of Public Programs and Artistic Producer for the Folger Theater, will be speaking on the theater's 2008 production of Macbeth, what went into developing the staging in order to make a nearly 400-year-old play fresh and exciting. We'll also view a video from the 2008 performance and hear from the directors. And then everyone who's here today can tune in and identify all the archetypes and stories that we're seeing in April. We'll also say then that we have a full schedule right through August now of different programs of lots of different topics, from nature to astronomy to poetry to all sorts. So again, if you wish to know more, perhaps could either Lisa, you or Loretta put up the Hydesville Aging link and the University Park Helping Hands link where people can go to get more information.
Sure. Hydesville, actually Loretta has put the May session up and also the April 21st session. I will just say that Janet Griffin, who is retiring from the Folger, and this is her last day at work. So we should just say, yay, Janet, and we'll see you in a month. And Loretta's put both of our websites up, HyattsvilleAgingInPlace.org and HelpingHands.org. You can copy the chat for all that information, and there was other references to the PMAI and Carol's website earlier in the chat. So just go ahead to the 3 dots at the bottom of the chat and hit save chat, and you'll be good. You'll have this forever. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Carol.
Well, thanks for having me here. It was great. It was great to be back home.
Great.